Here is the problem Washington cannot bomb away. Iran does not need to be stronger than the United States to create a strategic defeat. It only needs to make the price of American pressure higher than the political result America can actually obtain. And by April 2026, the fight has moved into exactly that zone. One narrow waterway, one nuclear stockpile, one sanctions network, and a region where the United States keeps winning military moments while losing freedom of action. This is not a claim that Iran is winning in a simple way. Iran is sanctioned, battered, internally pressured, and militarily outmatched. But strategy is not a scoreboard of explosions. Strategy is whether force changes the enemy's behavior. The United States wanted to stop nuclear leverage, contain Iran's regional network, protect shipping, reassure allies, and keep energy prices stable. The uncomfortable question is whether pressure has delivered those goals, or whether it has pushed Iran toward tools that hurt Washington more than Tehran expected. Start with geography. The Strait of Hormuz is only about 29 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point, with narrow navigable lanes in each direction. The International Energy Agency says about 20 million barrels per day of crude oil and oil products moved through it in 2025. That is roughly a quarter of world seaborne oil trade, so Iran does not need to control the world economy. It only has to threaten the place where a huge part of the world economy passes through a bottleneck. To understand defeat, define the end state. The United States was not trying to prove it could hit Iran. Everyone already knew that. The real objectives were political. Keep Iran far from a nuclear breakout, make sanctions change Tehran's choices, protect Gulf shipping without creating an energy shock, and stop Iran's regional network from setting the tempo. If those outcomes move farther away after years of pressure, then the problem is not American firepower. The problem is that firepower is not converting into control. The pressure spreads because most of the oil leaving Hormuz is not headed to the United States. The IAEA says around 80% of the oil transiting the strait is destined for Asia, and China and India together received 44% of crude exports through the route in 2025. That complicates Washington's coalition math. The US may lead the military response, but the economic pain lands across importers, insurers, shippers, refiners, and governments that do not always want the same escalation path. That leverage became measurable in 2026. The U.S. Energy Information Administration estimated 7.5 million barrels per day of crude production shut in during March because flows through Hormuz were limited. For April, it assessed the disruption would rise to 9.1 million barrels per day. Brent averaged $103 in March, and EIA expected a second quarter peak of $115. Suddenly, an Iran problem was also a gasoline, diesel, inflation, shipping, and election problem. A superpower usually wants alternatives. In Hormuz, the alternatives are limited. The IEA estimates roughly 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day of available crude capacity could be redirected through routes outside the strait, mainly in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. But almost 20 million barrels per day moved through Hormuz in 2025. That gap is the leverage. Iran can pressure a system that cannot simply reroute itself overnight. The first strategic problem is sanctions. After the United States reimposed oil sanctions in 2018, Iran's crude and condensate exports fell hard, reaching about 400,000 barrels per day in 2020. But EIA says exports recovered to nearly 1.4 million barrels per day by 2023, as shipments to China grew. That is not a sanctions victory in the political sense. It is a pressure campaign that created discounts, middlemen, shadow fleets, and workarounds without forcing the central concession Washington wanted. This is where sanctions become a global game. Washington can punish the seller, the shipper, the broker, the insurer, and the bank. But if major buyers keep finding ways to take discounted barrels, the pressure becomes expensive rather than decisive. Iran earns less than it would in a normal market, but less is not zero. And in a long confrontation, survival revenue can be enough to keep the state, the security apparatus, and the bargaining position alive. FinCEN identified approximately $9 billion of potential Iranian shadow banking activity through U.S. correspondent accounts in 2024. Treasury kept sanctioning tankers, brokers, managers, and companies tied to Iranian petroleum. That proves enforcement was active. It also proves the network existed at serious scale. Every new sanction can close a door, but Iran's advantage is that it only needs enough doors left open to survive, fund partners, and wait out political cycles in Washington. The nuclear track shows the same pattern. The 2015 agreement limited Iran's stockpile and enrichment level. The United States withdrew in 2018. Iran then began stepping away from its nuclear commitments, and the IAEA reported that by June 2025 Iran had an estimated 440.9 kilograms of uranium hexafluoride, enriched up to 60% U-235. 60% is not weapons grade, but it is far beyond normal civilian power reactor fuel and much closer to the political threshold that creates leverage. Then came the dramatic military answer. In June 2025, the U.S. Defense Department said Operation Midnight Hammer used B-2 bombers, massive ordnance penetrators, and Tomahawk missiles against Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. DoD described severe damage, but here's the strategic paradox. Destroying infrastructure is not the same as destroying knowledge, political will, or bargaining power. The IAEA later said inspectors had withdrawn for safety and Iran suspended cooperation. That means less visibility at the exact moment visibility mattered most. Iran's second advantage is distribution. It does not need a symmetrical army to match the United States ship for ship or plane for plane. It can distribute pressure across partners, maritime risk, missile threats, cyber pressure, and political bargaining. Each front may be manageable by itself. Together, they force Washington to defend many things at once: oil routes, Gulf allies, Israel, bases, shipping insurance, and domestic prices. That is how a weaker state can turn the map into a cost machine. The IAEA's language after the attacks is strategically important. Inspectors were withdrawn because of safety concerns, and Iran's decision to suspend cooperation was described as deeply regrettable. In plain English, the world had less direct visibility into a program that had become more advanced. That is the inverse of the original nuclear deal. The deal traded limits and monitoring for sanctions relief. The breakdown produced damage, suspicion, and fewer ways to verify what mattered. By April 2026, the public signals were not clean victory. Markets swung on every claim about whether Hormuz was open. AP reported that U.S. stocks had jumped more than 12% from a late March bottom on hopes the United States and Iran could avoid the worst economic scenario. That is the point. When global markets become a hostage to whether your adversary permits maritime normality, coercion has turned into mutual exposure. Iran is hurt, but Washington is also constrained. The United States still has enormous power. It can strike, sanction, seize, patrol, and isolate, but each tool now comes with a strategic tax. More strikes can deepen the nuclear opacity problem. More sanctions can expand black market systems. More naval pressure can increase the energy shock. More diplomacy can look like rewarding escalation. Iran's advantage is not in vulnerability. It is that every American answer carries a cost that Tehran can try to export. That is why the phrase strategic defeat matters. It does not mean Iran is stronger. It means the United States has not translated superior force into a stable political end state. The nuclear program became more advanced than under the deal. The sanctions system became a shadow economy. The regional conflict became an energy crisis, and the Strait of Hormuz turned into a switch that can move oil, stocks, shipping rates, and domestic politics far beyond the Gulf. But do not confuse leverage with victory. Iran is paying heavily. Sanctions, damaged infrastructure, inflation, political isolation, and the constant risk that escalation becomes uncontrollable. A country can gain leverage and still damage itself. The point is narrower and sharper. Iran has built enough tools to deny Washington a cheap win. In strategy, denial can be powerful. Sometimes the weaker side does not have to defeat the stronger side. It only has to prevent the stronger side from getting what it came for. So the final question is not whether America can hurt Iran. It can. The question is whether hurting Iran produces the strategic result America wants. If the world's strongest military still has to bargain with a sanctioned state over a waterway, a stockpile, and a regional network, then power is not the same as control. Is this an American strategic defeat or just the cost of containing Iran? Put your answer in the comments.